Hmm. And we are live. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this SFI Facebook Live conversation. As you can see on the screen, I am joined by a special guest whom I will introduce momentarily. But for now, I just wanted to say welcome and to explain a little bit about why we're here today. Today is May 1st, and it is an interesting anniversary that we thought we would use for the sake of having an important conversation. So 20 years ago today, President George W. Bush at the time declared what was called mission accomplished in Iraq following the US invasion. As we, of course, all know with historical hindsight, the hostilities in Iraq were far from over at that point. And in fact, this was a conflict that drug on for much longer and cost much more in terms of both money and human sacrifice from our military family community. But it gives us a good opportunity to reflect back on the conflict and the political and social context in which it was happening, and invite a special guest who brings a little bit of subject matter expertise here. So without further ado, let me introduce Nancy Lessin. Nancy is, I believe, one of the first possibly military parents we've had on a Facebook Live. So thank you, Nancy, for bringing that experience to bear. In 2002, Nancy helped co-found an organization called Military Families Speak Out. I believe you founded this, Nancy, with your late husband, Charlie Richardson, and another military parent, Jeffrey McKenzie. And at the time, correct me if I've got this wrong, but your son was a Marine who had already deployed at that point. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for being here. And I'll start by asking you to reflect, for the sake of our audience, what it felt like to be the parent of someone who was serving active duty in the military in 2002, with all that was going on. And if you can share how that experience of being a military parent ended up prompting you to found Military Families Speak Out.
Well, first, thank you for having me and for all of your good work. As you said, my stepson, my late husband, Charlie's son, joined the Marines. He was at Parris Island, 1998. He served in Iraq in 2003 with the 24th MEU, that's Marine Expeditionary Unit. Charlie and I had been active in the movement against the American war in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. Both of our fathers were World War II veterans. My father was a medic in the Army in Italy. Charlie's father was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne. Neither Charlie nor I were pacifists. We believed that war may at sometimes be necessary, but we did not see a US invasion of Iraq to be one of those times. A friend of ours defined a just war as one you'd send your own kids off to fight. When the drum beats for war were getting deafening in the late summer and fall of 2002, when our son had shipped off to the Middle East, many in the government and Congress and elsewhere were saying, we got to go to war. But they weren't going anywhere, nor were their loved ones. It was our loved ones who would be sent off as cannon fodder to kill and die in what we felt was an illegal, unjustifiable invasion. We were outraged and we were terrified. Charlie and I felt that the second worst thing that could happen to a military family is to have a loved one killed, but worse by far would be for a loved one to be killed in a war that shouldn't be happening, or to take a life in such a war, which would kill part of their soul. There was a demonstration against the invasion of Iraq in October 2002 in Washington, D.C. Our whole family went. We were carrying posters. Charlie and mine said, our son is a Marine, don't send him to war for oil. My daughter's poster said, my brother is a Marine, don't send him to war for oil. My niece's sign said, my cousin is a Marine, don't send him to war for oil. A father whose son was in the Army and soon to deploy came up to us at that demonstration. We exchanged phone numbers. That was Jeff McKenzie. In a phone conversation with him in November of 2002, our two families decided to form an organization of military families who were opposed to a US invasion and wanted to use our special voice to try to prevent it. And because we had been told that when a nation is about to go to war, families of service members are supposed to be patriotic, meaning silent, about any fears or doubts or opposition, we decided to call the organization Military Families Speak Out. We refused to be silenced, and we hoped our voice would help others inside and outside of the military to speak out. We believed that the most patriotic thing we could do for our loved ones, for our country, was to use our voices as military families to try to reverse the disastrous course that our nation was on. We knew it wasn't a military decision to go to war. It's a political one. And as part of the body politic, we were determined to engage in that public discourse and debate and be heard. Through primarily word of mouth, by December, the next month, we had about 200 military families who had joined. We were then involved in a press conference at the National Press Club in DC in early January 2003. It was covered on C-SPAN. By the next day, our membership doubled to 400 families. And over the years, it grew to about 4,000 military families. They were from all over the US and bases around the world. We were primarily parents and spouses of service members, but also we had siblings, children, other relatives. We covered all branches. We even had a Coast Guard family. The vast majority had loved ones in the enlisted services, and we became each other's lifelines. There's no one else but a military family who could relate to what we were going through. We helped each other get through some of the most difficult years of our lives because we had skin in the game. At the time when less than 1% of the US population was in the military or a military family, our voice was so important. But I do want to mention, we stood on the shoulders of other military families who had spoken out in years past, the Gold Star mothers who spoke out in the Vietnam era. And we also found that there had been a group of military families involved in trying to prevent the first Gulf War called Military Family Support Network. And the other thing I want to say is we work closely, often daily, with military and veterans groups, our real allies in everything: Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. As of 2004, Iraq Veterans Against the War. They're now called About Face, Veterans Against the War. And there was a group of active duty troops calling on Congress to withdraw all American military forces and bases from Iraq that were called Appeal for Redress. We also work closely with groups in the larger peace and anti-war movement, including United for Peace and Justice, the American Friends Service Committee, and U.S. Labor Against the War. Together, we were all building a movement to prevent and then end a war that should never have happened.
Well, can we just, I feel like I need to remark on how getting 200 families within a month and then doubling that. And this is before Facebook groups. So this is before the social media networks that a lot of us rely on nowadays to build community and membership. So truly remarkable, Nancy, what you all did. I think it just speaks to the relatability of what you were saying, that others felt like they were being seen and spoken for. I so appreciate you especially laying out a very nuanced difference between being a pacifist and a just war theorist. And I don't mean to get all poli-sci on us, because I know this isn't a 202 class in undergrad or anything, but I think to kind of put it in layperson's terms, the advocacy you and Military Families Speak Out did, it focused a bit on the war itself, the conflict itself that was occurring, but really what you focused on was actually the process by which the US declared war, made the decision to go to war, which, as you said, is a political decision, not so much a military decision, right? Although, of course, members of DoD can influence politicians and decision makers with intel and vice versa. But anyway, just to kind of really hone in on the process by which we went to war, you wanted to change that process from one that was opaque and unaccountable to something that was transparent and deliberative. Why was that an important fight for you? Why did you care enough to fight for it? And what lessons can we today in 2023 take from that fight fought back in 2003?
So what I'll say is in the fall of 2002, Congress spent more time discussing the use of steroids in baseball than they did on whether the US should invade Iraq. Remember that definition of just war, one you'd send your own kids off to fight? At that time, only one member of those serving in the US Senate and the House, 535 of them, had a son or daughter in the enlisted services. So in October 2002, when Congress passed this bipartisan resolution that stated the president is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, one, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and two, enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq, there was a giant flaw. The giant flaw was that Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution says that Congress and Congress alone can declare war. They can't hand this most momentous decision a nation can make over to another branch of government or anyone else, but that's what they did. They said, here, President Bush, you decide if, whether, and when to go to war. Article 1, Section 8 was specifically written to prevent any one person from being entrusted with the decision to send our nation to war. So John Bonifaz, a brilliant young lawyer and a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, developed a legal case to prevent this from happening. The legal case sought a temporary restraining order restraining George Bush and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld from invading Iraq absent a proper congressional declaration of war. The case was called Doe v. Bush. It included 3 military service members whose names were filed under John Doe's to protect their identity, a group of military family members, and several members of Congress. The case was filed in federal court in Boston in February of 2003. Charlie and I were the lead plaintiffs on the case, and the rest of the military families involved were members of MFSO. To make a long story short, we went 3 rounds in the courts, and on March 18th, 2003, the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against us. They said, among other things, that there wasn't a big enough dispute between the legislative branch and the executive branch. It wasn't as if Congress was saying to George Bush, you can't go to war, and Bush and Rumsfeld said they were going to go anyway. As an aside, I want to note, in questioning during the case, the lawyers for Bush and Rumsfeld were asked that question, whether they believed the president could go to war, even if Congress was opposed, and their answer was yes. John Bonifaz described the court's ruling as the judicial branch standing by as the president trampled on the Constitution. A day after our case failed, the shocking and awful shock and awe invasion of Iraq began, and this is not a coincidence. Attorney John Bonifaz reflected on the dismissal of Doe v. Bush after the invasion. He said, today we face an extraordinary moment in United States history. The president of the United States launched a premeditated first strike invasion of another country, the likes of which this nation has never before seen. This massive military operation sought to conquer and occupy Iraq for an indefinite period of time. This was not a random act of raw power. It was the first salvo of a new and dangerous US doctrine, a doctrine which advocates the unprovoked invasion and occupation of sovereign nations. This new doctrine threatens to destabilize the world, creating a new world order of chaos and lawlessness. For the sake of humanity, it must be stopped as soon as possible. So it was important for us to be involved in this case in 2003, and it's important 20 years later for all of us to be involved in restraining any future warrior king who wants to repeat the horrors of 20 years ago. The last war Congress actually declared was World War II. It's past time for Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to mean something.
Well, folks who are watching this tonight, I know are very familiar with just the issue of balancing various powers between various branches per constitutionality, because we talk a lot about that here at SFI. We've obviously focused on that 2002 authorization to use military force at the time, which surely, believe what you will about it at the time, here we are 20 years later, Iraq is now an ally and not an adversary. So surely now we can remove that authorization and rebalance authorities. But no, it's an interesting kind of bookend, the conversation that we're having between then and between now. So you've mentioned one of the various kind of tools in the toolbox that you and your group used at the time, that of litigation. And of course, there are lots of different tools one can use in this world of advocacy. And you've used lots of them. You've been involved in marches. You've been involved in more creative, artistic expression, testifying before Congress, telling personal stories at press conferences, you name it. Nancy's probably done it. And I was curious, Nancy, we've got lots of folks in the audience who are themselves really passionate and seasoned advocates and could probably, enjoy hearing you reflect on, how did you pick which tool in the toolbox to reach for at any given moment? Was it based on who the person was you were trying to influence, whether a decision maker themselves or the voters that decision makers are accountable to? Did it depend just on what people felt like doing, what skills you had? I'm sure all of the above. Tell us, yes. Peek behind the curtain.
All of the above. If we had a couple hours, I'd do this justice, but I'll try to do a thumbnail sketch. It's probably going to be too much anyway. But Charlie and I were longtime activists and had jobs in the labor movement. So we came to MFSO with some organizing skills, but MFSO itself was an organization of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And together we created and strategically used a large megaphone. We had a vision of what we wanted to do. And early on, we formed a diverse representative board of directors that guided all of the decisions. We developed chapters across the country. We developed talking points for each action, event, activity, and did training sessions for our members to prepare them for everything from press interviews to speaking engagements. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities, our focus was on building a strong enough movement to prevent the invasion. And like you said, we did everything and anything that we could that was going to put our voice out there, including engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, getting arrested, meeting with senators and members of Congress, a lot of time on TV and online and print media, and trying to put together creative actions. And I'll say once a national organization mobilizing for peace asked us to participate in a nationwide silent vigil that they were organizing all over the country. And I reminded them that our name was Military Families Speak Out, and we didn't do silence. So our members were then invited to be the featured speakers at the silent vigils. There were also disagreements we had at times with the larger peace movement, especially in the weeks leading up to the start of hostilities. A number of peace groups were spending time organizing day after the invasion events, including big die-ins to halt traffic in large cities. And we didn't want to spend a minute thinking about actions after an invasion. We still wanted to prevent an invasion. We said to them, whatever you're thinking of doing the day after, why don't you do it now? We never saw eye to eye on that, but so many opportunities just fell in our laps. We had a press release out within hours of Bush's mission accomplished speech 20 years ago today, including the names of military family members who could be interviewed to counter this lie. The first months of the occupation, we made military families available on a daily basis to provide the ground truth of what was going on. And we were called traitors and treasonous and unpatriotic. And I remember an NPR show featuring one of our members. A congressman called him unpatriotic. His response was this: all 4 of my sons are in the military. 2 are currently in Iraq. In Congress, only 1 of you has a son or daughter in the military. So I think that makes me 4 times as patriotic as all of Congress. On July 2nd, 2003, Bush gave his "Bring 'em on" speech. I don't know if you remember this, but he said, "There are some who feel like the conditions are such that they can attack us there. My answer is bring 'em on." That very night, we had a phone call with our military and veterans coalitions and created our Bring Them Home Now campaign. Bush said, "Bring them on," and we said, "Bring them home now." For the anniversary of the invasion, the first anniversary, we went to Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of the 82nd Airborne, for a march and rally. Our theme was "Support our troops, bring them home now." A number of military spouses from Fort Bragg joined us, and so too did some active duty service members. We used every opportunity to get our voice out, issuing available for interview releases at the State of the Union address, Republican and Democratic national conventions, every time there was a large number of troop deaths. And when we had to counter official voices claiming that the increased suicides were from financial problems and relationship troubles and not related to the multiple deployments and taking the lives of children, etc. When Bush traveled to his ranch in Crawford, Texas for a 5-week vacation in 2005, Gold Star mom Cindy Sheehan decided to go there to get him to answer her question, "For what noble cause did my son die?" An encampment began that included many of our organizations. And we said that ditch outside of Crawford had phenomenal acoustics. It carried our voices around the country and around the world. When we were at Crawford, we decided to take the show on the road. We organized 3 buses to go on tour across the US over 3 routes: Southern, Midwest, and Northern, stopping in large cities, small towns, near military bases. Each bus had military family members, returned Iraq service members, and veterans of other conflicts. And we connected with military families, service members, and veterans, as well as members of the public on each stop. In 2006, one of our members came up with the idea of doing a summer-long action in front of Congress that we called Operation House Call. Each morning for the weeks of that summer, in front of the Cannon House office building, we set out pairs of boots representing service members killed in Iraq that day, starting from the first day when we set up our banner that said "Military Families Speak Out, Operation House Call." We also set out men's, women's, and children's shoes representing Iraqis killed each day. As the display grew, we cornered members of Congress coming to work. We set up meetings with all senators and members of Congress that summer. At that time, there was an average of 2 service members being killed each day. So we took 2 pairs of boots with us into each meeting and put them right on the table that we were meeting around. With senators and House members who were in favor of ending the occupation, we strategized about how to move their colleagues. We tried to be as creative as possible to keep getting media attention. One year for the winter holidays, our chapters across the country set up holiday tables outside in front of the homes of politicians who were still supporting funding for the occupation, and they ate a holiday meal there. Each table had an empty chair representing our loved ones who weren't able to join because they were either in Iraq or tragically would never be coming back. There would always be an empty chair at those holiday tables. The bottom line was we knew it had never been a politician that ended a war. It was always a social movement. So our focus was on using our voices to keep building a movement powerful enough to move decision makers to bring an end to the occupation.
What your description really highlights, for me at least, is how many different lanes there are based on someone's own personal skills, preferences, you name it. If there's not just one way to be an advocate, because some of us want to be in front of a camera and some of us never do. Some of us are much more skilled in the kind of creative art expression part of advocacy, and that is just as valid, if not more, because like you said, it helps keep things fresh in which is necessary for that coverage and attention. So I just want to point out, we've got a comment in the chat, Nancy, from one of our SFI members and volunteers who was working on the Senate side in 2002 and 2003. And it sounds like Senator Johnson's office had a son in the National Guard at the time, and therefore that was a very personal decision, it sounds like, for the senator. So hi, Megan, thank you for adding that comment. It's it's a really valuable reminder of where we've been and where we're headed. Speaking of, Nancy, my last question for you this evening has to do with that legacy of military families speak out. I was hoping you could share a couple pointers for today's military partners, parents, and kids, especially SFI members like are tuning in tonight. Those of us who want to take up a baton of just war, of trying to improve the processes by which our country declares war, of wanting to educate our civilian counterparts the consequences of war in a way that they may not understand directly. Those are all parts of a legacy that military families speak out has left that we and others want to honor and want to pick up. What lessons do you want us to learn?
I would say at this point that any group talking about sane foreign policy, figuring out how to correct systemic problems, including those that led to the unjustifiable invasion and occupation of Iraq, is continuing the work. Military families speak out still exists. It's smaller, it's still vocal, it's still marching. 20 years ago, we said, bring them home now, take care of them when they get here, and never ever let this happen again. Military Families Speak Out is now focused on the latter two of those three. There's still so much to do. I hope in the future SFI and MFSO can be in touch and see if there are ways to work together on goals that the organizations have in common. I think the most important thing I want to leave with is we will never forget how powerful the voices of military families are in trying to make a better country and a more just world. And please keep figuring it out, speaking out. I think in this, there's not a blueprint. We say we make the road by walking it. We'll all be making the road by walking it, and keep walking it, and keep keep doing what you're doing and figuring out how to do it better and learning and growing.
Those sound like orders worth following. Thank you so much, Nancy, for being here tonight, for sharing about your experience. And I think it's safe to say that we will, in fact, be in touch. Don't worry about that. Thank you again to everyone in the audience for tuning in and for sharing your questions and comments. Feel free to continue sending us thoughts as you have them. And with that, I wish everyone a good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.